I'm Troy Sangaron. I'm the Senior Director here at KAI. Um, I think when you think about the North Korean nuclear issue, the one thing that we often come into, and the other challenge the United States has faced on the nuclear front, has been with Iran. Clearly, there are differences, both in terms of culture, the economies, their openness to the world, the state, and the intents of their programs. But while North Korea has been very explicit in its goals and having publicly tested weapons, we clearly know what their desire is. Iran has never gone so far as to test a weapon, and so there is still questions of what the intent ultimately for their weapons program is. But we also know that there's been
So they don't even have
They
a
don't
weapons
have a
program.
weapons program anymore, according to our intelligence agencies.
Apologize, say our suspicions, And then, but there's also always been these ties. They have a scientific and economic cooperation agreement. There's suspicions that they work together on ballistic missiles. So these are two issues that have often been tied together. And I think we're fortunate today to have a panel with great experience and depth on all of these issues. To my immediate right, we have Barbara Slavin, who is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for AlMonitor.com. Next to her, we have Bruce Klingner, who is a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation and also has previous experience working on North Korea at the CIA. We have Mark Fitzpatrick, who is the executive director of the IISS Americas and the head of the IISS Nonproliferation and Nuclear Policy Program. You have a very long title.
I know.
And also has extensive experience working on nonproliferation at the Department of State. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Barbara. When we think about the Iran deal and how we got there, we often talk about the sanctions having brought Iran to the table. What role did sanctions actually play in the talks, and how long did it really take for that pressure to build if they did have a role?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm one of a select few people who's actually been to both North Korea and Iran multiple times, so it's kind of nice to bring the two parts of the expertise together. I wanted to say at the outset that, a lot of people make this comparison or they try to bring these issues together, but there are massive differences between Iran, which is a large, influential country that relies on exporting oil and pays at least some attention to popular sentiment, and North Korea, which is obviously isolated, oddball, hereditary dictatorship that relies mostly on China. And so I think we have to say that right out at front. I kind of resent putting them together, even though we always do put them together. In terms of sanctions did play an important role, particularly after 2012, when there were very stringent curbs put on Iran's export of oil. And the key there was that the Europeans and Japan, Korea joined with the United States in imposing these very, very severe sanctions on Iran. That definitely had an impact. But sanctions alone did not bring about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was only when the United States agreed that Iran could retain a limited uranium enrichment program that the breakthrough occurred. So, people often say that sanctions, drove Iran to the table. Well, definitely they contributed, but without compromise, there would not have been a JCPOA.
So, Bruce, we're trying a similar tactic with North Korea. The policy phrase now is maximum pressure, but the idea being to use sanctions to get North Korea to the table. In the last few days, we've seen that South Korea is saying that in their meetings with Kim Jong-un, that he's willing to talk about denuclearization with the United States. How do you see the efforts so far? And to sort of play off Barbara's question, because it's something I want to get in since you mentioned I want to talk about now. She was saying that the key to the deal was letting them retain part of their nuclear program. Do you see that as even a viable option with North Korea?
I think on the maximum pressure policy, it's sort of maximum pressure in 32-point font, wait for it, end engagement in like 8-point font. And several times the president has said his policy is maximum pressure, and he forgets to put the other half in. So, I think too often in Washington, the debate amongst all of us has been sort of this what I see as the false paradigm of negotiations and engagement and diplomacy or sanctions. And it's two of many tools in the toolbox. Many people, particularly those more in favor of engagement, will say, well, sanctions alone won't do anything. It's like, I don't know any sanctions advocate who says it's sanctions only. It's sort of like saying, do you use a hammer or a screwdriver to build a house? Well, you use both, along with a bunch of other tools, and sometimes one is more appropriate than the other. So I think you sort of have to keep emphasizing it's part of a comprehensive, integrated strategy. So, I think the Iran deal, and I don't work Iran, so I'm just looking at it from afar, but I think it was the pressure and the open door of diplomacy which brought them in. And whether you like the final deal or not, I think it was those two tools, along with others, that brought them to the table and then ended up with a result. So, with North Korea, I think there's a lot of kind of confusion about when people say, should we talk to North Korea? And I think what they're doing is mixing two different levels of talks. And I'd say sort of the low level is, diplomatic to diplomatic conversations. I mean, diplomats doing their job, talking to people you may not want to bring home to mother. And on that, I think the U.S. has tried, both in this administration and previous administrations, to try to engage with North Korea diplomatically. And frequently, or mostly, it's been North Korea that's turned them down. I mean, when a diplomat calls and says, calls New York and says, do you want to get together? And they say, didn't you remember this channel is closed at the time and you're not supposed to be using this phone number? So, and remember, Pence was going to meet with North Korea, including someone on the U.S. sanctions for human rights violations 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was North Korea that rejected it. So, and then the high level is talks in the sense of negotiation, 6-party talks. And there, I think you do need a precondition, even of is there a 1 in a trillion chance they say that they will give up their weapons? I mean, if they're not going to give us that, then you don't walk back into the negotiating room. Now with the reported agreement, they're sort of saying we're kind of back to square one, that, yeah, there is a 1 in a trillion chance if you do X, Y, and Z. At least that's a step forward. I'm pretty cynical and skeptical, but I think there's enough there that, as we've been trying, we should have dip-to-dip discussion.
Could I just add something about the effectiveness of sanctions and the use of sanctions as a tool? I've been advocating it much of my career. But it's important to realize that the effectiveness of sanctions has to do with one's willingness to lift the pressure if the other side meets your demands. And reapplying the sanctions if the other side is meeting the demands undermines the whole point of the sanctions. And in the case of North Korea and, well, in Iran right now with regard to the nuclear deal, what the Trump administration is going to do, threatening to reimpose sanctions even though Iran is meeting the deal. In the case of North Korea, there are other tools that include positive benefits. One of them has to be a willingness to lift sanctions incrementally, targeted, linked to the degree to which North Korea makes concessions.
I might distinguish on the sanctions is two things. One is, have sanctions been effective? I think we need to identify what I see as 5 objectives of sanctions and targeted financial measures. It's to enforce UN resolutions, U.S. law, international law, which is a good thing. 2, it's to impose a penalty on those that violate them. If they mean anything, you've got to enforce them. Someone robs a bank, you got to arrest them. 3, you're putting in place measures to make it harder for North Korea or others to import things they need for their prohibited programs, including money from illicit activity. 4, you're making it harder for them to proliferate. And 5, with all the other tools, you're trying to get them to abide by the resolutions and behave themselves, and et cetera. So I'd argue on 4 of the 5, they've been effective to some degree. And also on sanctions, I distinguish between sort of trade sanctions and law enforcement. So some things, coal and oil caps or bans, I see those as the things that you can take off or reduce or weaken in return for positive moves. But some things I see as you never change. It's, if someone is committing money laundering in the U.S. financial system, you don't remove that sanction. So some I just distinguish between sort of the trade kind of things and then law enforcement.
It looked like you wanted to say something as well.
No, I just was admiring your definition of diplomacy, talking to people you wouldn't want to bring home to mother. I always remember Rich Armitage, the former Deputy Secretary of State, and he said that diplomacy is the art of having the other guy have your way. So, and as he often pointed out, if you don't talk to the other guy, you have no idea if you can Help
or
him
it's-
have your way.
Or it's the art of saying nice doggy while you look for a rock.
Yes, that's another Armitage expression as well. Yeah.
So, Barbara, I wanted to ask you. So, Mark mentioned that we're still applying pressure or threatening to apply pressure on Iran. When we look at the deal we have now, what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses?
Well, its strengths are pretty good. I think essentially the main one is that it makes it pretty much impossible for Iran to build a nuclear weapon without anybody detecting it until at least 2030. Iran is not allowed to have more than 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium, and that is, I believe, a quarter of the amount that you would need if you were to enrich it to weapons grade to make one nuclear weapon. So as long as they only have 300 kilograms of LEU, they can't build a bomb. And then there are other things that it did as well. It forbade uranium enrichment in an underground facility called Fordo. It made Iran reconfigure a heavy water reactor at Arak such that it can't produce very much plutonium. And of course, it has the most rigorous inspection system ever negotiated in one of these arms control agreements. So that's pretty good. Now you're going to ask me the weakness, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the weakness, to the extent there is that there are provisions that sunset. So all of these, not the inspection and so on, but these very stringent curbs on the amount of low-enriched uranium, on the number of centrifuges Iran can have operating, the type of centrifuges Iran can have operating, those curbs do gradually come off. And critics of the deal say that Iran can just be patient and sit back and wait and then build up an industrial strength uranium enrichment capacity and go for broke for a bomb at the end of these time limits. But in general, I mean, it's better to have the JCPOA than not. It was better to have the agreed framework than not. And we all, I think, regret that the George W. Bush administration let the perfect be the enemy of the good in 2002 and walked away, stopped providing fuel oil and so on when evidence emerged that there was a covert enrichment program in North Korea.
So, Mark, I guess in some ways we're back to that point with Iran. President Trump has said that if there aren't changes made, that he will, not waive sanctions, which we need to do. So, what kind of changes is he looking for, and are any of these objectives achievable?
So, President Trump has said some different things to different audiences, but they boil down to three things that he's demanding. One, I think, is easy. One is difficult but doable. And one is impossible unless you just totally redefine it. So the easy one is that he is saying that the IEA needs to have access wherever they need it to facilities in Iran. Well, that's easy because the IEA has that access. Director General Amano just said so. They have access anywhere they need. Now, what some critics of the JCPOA say is that no, they need access now everywhere to every military site where Iran might have some hidden nuclear activity. Well, that's not going to happen. No state would open up its military facilities to inspectors like that. So anyway, I think that's easy as long as you take it what Trump said. The difficult one is regarding missiles. Now here the president has said that the Congress needs to state in U.S. law that Iran's missile program is intrinsically linked to its nuclear program and that severe sanctions should be applied against its missile activities. So this is difficult because that's just not true. It's not true that Iran's missile program in its entirety is intrinsically linked to its nuclear program. Some of Iran's missiles are, probably, and some are not, obviously. My institute just put out a report last week where we showed which ones were and which ones weren't and which ones maybe were. So I think if that can be defined in a way that says, certain missiles, or particularly ICBMs, would be directly linked. But fortunately, Iran doesn't have any ICBMs, nor even an ICBM program. They have space launchers, which put satellites up in the air, but those aren't ICBMs in disguise. And we saw that in North Korea, where we were all worried about the Unha space launches that North Korea was sending satellites up into air. But North Korea didn't put those Unhas to use as ICBMs. They developed something totally different, the Hwasong 14s and 15s. So if you distinguish, it's doable. The third demand is really, I think it's impossible. It's a demand that the sunset clauses that Barbara mentioned basically be lifted. That if Iran, any time in the future, exceeds the limits that are supposed to be gradually lifted as of 2026, if I have it right, about then, that U.S. sanctions would be reimposed. And that's totally rewriting the deal. So Europeans absolutely are not going to go along with that. And because the Europeans aren't going to go along with it, the Democrats aren't going to go along with it. So the only way it would work is if you did something, tricked Trump into thinking that he got what he wanted by saying, okay, look, we're going to deal with this in the future, or we're going to apply sanctions, and we're going to make sure that we get to this at some point in the future. But the way he said it, it's impossible.
Can I just, two fingers on that. I think what they're trying to come up with is some statement of principles that there will need to be a follow-on agreement to the JCPOA, as there have been to many other arms control and non-proliferation agreements, and the Europeans have agreed that the goal of such talks would be to keep Iran from having an industrial size enrichment program or making highly enriched uranium or something like that. I think it's doable. I mean, it's not so much a trick as a shiny object to dangle in front of the president's eyes saying, you won. We fixed it, or we are fixing it. And therefore, this is better than what you inherited. You can claim victory. So that's what they're trying to do. But in return, the Trump administration has to promise that it's not going to have these hissy fits every 3 months and threaten to walk out of the deal. That as long as Iran is implementing the deal, the United States will continue to have the sanctions waivers. And I think that's what they're working on now in Europe.
So speaking of sanctions waivers, we have a deadline coming up on May 12th.
Mm-hmm.
What if we don't get a deal and the sanctions aren't waived? What would happen then?
Well, then the United States is in material breach of the agreement, and we will have to see whether the other parties will remain within the agreement. The Iranians have said that they will stay in the deal as long as the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese stay in the deal. I think that probably would be the outcome, at least for a time. But, the Europeans, what steps will they take to protect their businesses? Will the United States go forward and actually try to enforce these new sanctions or renewed sanctions on European businesses? This will cause all kinds of legal problems. I would imagine cases at the WTO. We have steel tariffs now and aluminum tariffs. This would be yet another huge issue. The Iranians would enjoy driving a gigantic new wedge between the Europeans and the United States. We won't get the kind of sanctions we had in 2012, 2013. That only came because U.S. allies were on board. So I think it would be quite disastrous. And then if Iran decides that it's not getting the economic benefits that it needs from the deal, if their oil exports go down again, for example, they might start to cheat around the edges. They might increase the amount of low-enriched uranium, start working with more advanced centrifuges, and the whole thing could fall apart.
So, Mark, the goal here ultimately is to get a deal, either a permanent deal with the Iranians, whatever we mean by permanent there, and one with the North Koreans. But, and Barbara mentioned this early on, we like to take and look at Iran and North Korea because we have issues with both of their nuclear programs. But ultimately, they're very different. And specifically, even their political systems are actually quite different. So what role does the difference in the political systems play, maybe in either helping get an Iran deal or maybe making a North Korea deal more difficult?
I'm glad that you phrased it that way, that emphasizing that their political systems are very different, because we sometimes tend to see them in monochrome colors as being somehow they're both rogue states and impossible to deal with, but very, very different. On the one hand, one could say that when you have a dictatorship, you only have to convince one person. So in a way, that's easier. And there's debate among Korean scholars of whether Kim Jong-un really wields sole unitary power, or whether there's some other group in the bureaucracy that is really ruling the country. But it does seem, I think there's evidence that when Kim Jong-un makes a decision that other people generally fall in line. So getting to Kim Jong-un is important. It's been dismaying that nobody has talked with him besides Dennis Rodman. So I was very happy that the South Koreans made an inroad and finally met with him for 4 hours over dinner. That was a brilliant success for the South Korean government. Now, in Iran, so you do have a supreme leader, and supposedly has overriding authority in most aspects of strategic issues. But in Iran, the system is it's based on consensus among the elite. So the supreme leader has to have this consensus before he can really make big decisions. And that means big decisions take a long time to be made in Iran. So it's, in a way, harder to strike a deal with that kind of a system. But once you strike it and you've got all those elements on board, maybe it's easier to keep the deal. You don't have just one person who could decide to change the deal, as in the North Korean case, and they have gone back on deals in the past. There's another element of this that's important, is who are the stakeholders in the respective countries? In the case of Iran, there are multiple stakeholders. And in the case of the Iran nuclear deal, some of those stakeholders are very much supportive of a deal that helps to lift sanctions and improve their overall economy. So when you're making deals with other countries, you have to identify who are the stakeholders and how to appeal to them and give them leverage to help support the deal that you want. In the case of North Korea, it's very unknown to me who are the other stakeholders, and even if we could identify them, how we would appeal to them.
So, Bruce, continuing on this idea of the dynamics in negotiations, as I mentioned in the beginning, Iran hasn't ever tested a nuclear weapon. North Korea has. How does the fact that it's not just a test, but they've had multiple tests, they've had a hydrogen bomb test, how does that change the negotiating dynamic?
I think it makes it much more difficult, perhaps impossible. One thing, I just thought of another definition for diplomacy. I think it was Adlai Stevenson said it's protocol, geritol, and alcohol. I think it's the alcohol to deal with all the protocol.
Doesn't work with Iran.
Right. Maybe that's what's missing, yeah. I think if you look at all of North Korea's capabilities, it's not just they've tested a weapon. They've tested, we think, A bombs and H bombs. Experts will differ on the capabilities, but, I think the assessment is they've got at least 30 nukes. Parts of the intel community, according to leaked documents, think it may be up to 60. Others think it's not that high. I think everyone thinks that the Nodong medium-range ballistic missile is already nuke capable, so that South Korea and Japan are already under a nuclear threat. It's not theoretical. It's not several years from now. They're working on the two intermediate range systems that can hit Guam, and North Korean officials told me last year that both of those would be deployed to military units soon. And of course, we're focused on the two different ICBMs and maybe more. Last year, 2 years ago, I guess now, they paraded these big containerized things that we still don't know what they are. And we know there's a whole bunch of other systems, solid fuel, et cetera, that they're working on and haven't deployed yet. So, it's certainly the ICBM capability that people are focused on, but we can't overlook the threat already to our allies. But, I think it just makes it that much more difficult to try to negotiate away something, that is tangible. And clearly they've had, years where they've been saying we will never, ever, ever give them up. It's the treasured sword, and they'll point to their reasons for justification. When I think, I like analogies. It's kind of simple ideas for simple minds like mine. And one I'm thinking of is later this month I'll be in New Zealand for a conference, but I've already reserved a great white shark cage dive, which similar to one I did in Australia, which was a lot of fun. Anyway, what I would equate it to is negotiating the agreed framework, which perhaps at the time we didn't know they were already violating 3 international agreements, and they were about to violate a 4th when they signed the agreed framework. But it's sort of like getting into the shark cage, and the shark's on the outside. It's swimming around, it's scary, but it's not quite there yet. Now it'd be sort of like the deckhand opening the hatch of the cage to have you go down the ladder, and you're just like, excuse me, the shark's inside the cage. I see, yeah, it's a little more difficult, but it'll be a little more exciting. I think that's where we are trying to negotiate right now is it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot less likely to be a fun ride. But I think at least now they're giving us an opening. Some would see this week as a diplomatic breakthrough. I think it's more sort of a promise to go back to square one. But it's not our first rodeo. But I think we do need to try to get on the bucking horse again. But I'm pretty skeptical it'll be successful.
Well, to keep with the analogies, it seems like before we were maybe negotiating for a compact car from North Korea. Now we're negotiating for like a low-end luxury vehicle or something.
Right. Well, and continuing the car analogy, it's, during the Trump administration so far, there's been the focus on the pressure and discussions of, preventive attack as an option. And this diplomacy has kind of been dumped in our lap very quickly, I think, because of, President Moon's initiative and sort of desperate reach out for the olive branch. But right now, the diplomacy, I think, for the U.S. side is just kind of like the dog that caught the car. Is what does he do with it now? He never caught it before, so he doesn't know really what to do.
So, Barbara, we've talked about the dynamics with Iran. We've talked about the dynamics, with North Korean in a position. But there's another dynamic at play here, and that's the U.S. domestic side. On the Iran deal, we had the Iran nuclear review bill that was put through by Chairman Corker, I should say, and everything. There's still obviously political resistance to the Iran deal in the United States. What do you think, having sort of watched from the Iran perspective, that resistance means for what it might look like for the political resistance to a North Korea deal if President Trump were to actually strike one?
Well, I was around watching Congress, a Republican-led House, ruin the agreed framework back in the late 1990s when they would be very, very hesitant, very late about approving the money for the fuel oil deliveries that were promised under the agreed framework. Of course, there was tremendous foot dragging on building the light water reactors that were supposed to take the place of the ones that the North Koreans had. So, if it's a deal that required any kind of U.S. aid that Congress had to approve, that would be, I think, a non-starter, frankly. I don't know what North Korea is looking for now. I mean, in the past, they always were looking for some sort of security guarantee, some sort of acknowledgement of their right to exist as a state, an end to the U.S. hostile policy, diplomatic relations, full diplomatic relations. Something like that, is a possibility if they would accept it. They're certainly not going to get food aid and fuel oil and things like that as they did under the agreed framework. I think Congress would be hugely relieved at anything that would mean that there is no longer a prospect of war with North Korea. You've seen the concerns expressed, including within the U.S. military. 10,000 Americans would die on the first day, not to mention the thousands of Koreans, Japanese, who knows who all else would be brought into this. So I think there'd be relief if there was some sort of agreement. There'd be skepticism, clearly. Congress would want to monitor it, but I don't see that Congress would necessarily be an impediment. On the Iran deal, by the way, the polls now show that it's popular, that more Americans support it than did back in 2015. And I think we've seen great reluctance on the part of the Congress to tear up the deal, and Congress thinking about ways in which to keep the United States in the deal.
So, Mark, is there anything that you would suggest or the Trump administration could do to sort of take and keep Congress on board if negotiations start leaning towards a deal, and to make sure we don't repeat what happened with the agreed framework?
Yeah. So when you say don't repeat what happened to the agreed framework, you left out some of the, what you mean by that. And so just to explore that for a minute and then answer the questions. It's often said that because Congress didn't appropriate the money quickly or on time, that this was breaking the commitment to the deal. I don't accept that. It was slow, but eventually they got it. And I don't think the North Koreans regard that as what the United States did wrong that broke their commitment. What the North Koreans say is what they were expecting that they didn't get was the normalization of relations with the United States. And you don't have to believe me. Bob Gallucci, I heard him just yesterday that this is what they repeatedly say is they didn't get. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I don't blame the United States at all. North Korea, throughout the days of the agreed framework, after it was in place, continued to do things that themselves impeded the delivery. I mean, at one point they insisted on a 6-fold wage increase for their workers. And that wasn't going to be acceptable. So the other partners brought in Uzbek workers to North Korea. Another time, 1996, a North Korean submarine grounded itself on South Korea's eastern shore. It was there for what I have heard described as a normal exfiltration of commandos into South Korea. How's that normal? I mean, you're putting commandos into the country who is assisting you to build a nuclear energy program. That slowed down things. That created a negative political vibe. The Taepodong in 1998. There's a lot of things that North Korea did that really undermined the political support for this deal. So what could Congress do? Well, you might ask, first of all, what could North Korea do, or any country? Stop those kind of provocations that create such animosity and undermine the political will for a deal. But lastly, so suppose that Trump, just imagine, okay, use your imaginations, that Trump would strike a deal with North Korea. Then how likely is it that the Congress would undermine that deal? Probably less likely than Trump undermining Obama's deal, because this would be a Republican president striking a deal, and he'd need the Democrats to be on board. And Democrats would be on board because they're Democrats, right? They like deals, they like diplomacy, they like honoring commitments. So I think the real answer to your question is bipartisanship, obviously. If you can get a bipartisan support for the deal, and that, when we go back to the original question that Barbara was asked, what was the weakness of the deal? That was the weakness. Didn't have bipartisan support from the very beginning. I would say not for lack of trying, but didn't have it, so that really undermined the longevity, the survivability of the deal.
Mm-hmm. Just two fingers. I mean, I was complaining about Congress, but what killed the deal was when George W. Bush came in. I remember there had been missile talks. Madeleine Albright, I was there when she went in 2000, October 2000. They were close to an agreement on ballistic missiles. And Colin Powell came in. He was all enthusiastic. Jim Kelly is here. He remembers. And Powell said, we're going to continue those missile talks. And the next day, President Bush said no and started talking about how evil a regime North Korea was. And Powell was forced to eat his words and say he'd gotten a little too far forward in his skis. And the Bush administration came in determined to destroy the agreed framework, and John Bolton has said this publicly many times, in the same way that the Trump administration came in with an apparent determination to destroy the JCPOA. So I won't put it on Congress, I'll put it on the executive branch.
I might have a different interpretation of a number of the events which were named. The U.S. was sort of the minority stakeholder, as it were, in the agreed framework in the Quito. And when the submarine washed up on shore in September 1996 was when the South Korean National Assembly was debating whether to allot, I think it was $3.5 billion. And having commandos in a running gun battle where I think it was 3 South Korean civilians were killed kind of puts a damper on the legislature saying, let's give money to these guys.
Sure.
And similarly, the Japanese Diet was debating, I think it was its $1 billion contribution when a TD-1 flew overhead. And again, it kind of put a damper on their generosity. And, so again, in my view, again and again, it was North Korea's behavior. And then, in 2002, when evidence became much more clear of what we had been suspecting, that there was a covert uranium program in violation of the agreed framework of the North-South Denuclearization Accord, of the NPT, of the IAEA safeguards. That again kind of put a damper on let's continue going down. Now you can debate whether once you know your opponent is cheating, whether you should try to adapt to that and work up language, or you say, I'm taking my ball home. We can debate that. But again, I would put the onus on North Korea for a catalytic event on all 3 of those. Also on how close we were to a missile deal. I was in the White House meetings as the +1, sitting behind the DCI or the DDCI, et cetera. we weren't, as Madeline and Wendy Sherman will say, this close. We were not. There were meetings with diplomats in Kuala Lumpur with North Koreans, and the North Koreans were saying, if you send your president, he will be happy. And the U.S. diplomats were saying, no, we don't deploy a president to negotiate. We deploy a president to sign an agreement where we know all the punctuation is. So you need to deal with them in Kuala Lumpur. And the North Koreans said, no, he will be happy. And so they made very clear at the time that if you don't make the dips in KL happy, it ain't happening. And it didn't happen. So some in the government were advocating, send Bill and the force of his personality would get everything we'd want. We'd eliminate 9 months of moving it up through the hierarchy. The majority of the government was saying, no, that's not how we do it. So I would disagree on how close we were. We were not close. And so when people say we just the
but
administration.
Should the talks have been continued? I mean, the fact that that Bush came in and immediately dumped a bucket of cold water on the whole idea of negotiating a missile agreement. You can imagine that didn't, give us much leverage.
There's not a lot of impetus for signing a missile agreement if you feel they're violating the existing agreements. But anyway, we can differ on that.
Well, so speaking of agreements, Bruce, and since I think Mark had referred to it as like a magical thing or something, if we did get an agreement with the North Koreans, what do you think would be the elements that have to be in this agreement, and specifically, what kind of security arrangements do you think the North Koreans might be willing to accept to actually give up their nuclear weapons?
Well, I would say, right now we're obviously in the very preliminary stages. We haven't even had sort of engagement. If we kind of skip and jump down the path and think we're in the negotiating room, I think two fatal flaws in every agreement we've had with the North Koreans is that quite different from arms control treaties we had with the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And I was the chief of the arms control branch at the agency. I was on the CFE treaty delegation for a few rounds. I'd say, very vaguely worded text, very short, very vaguely worded agreements, and a lack of sufficient verification. So if you look at the arms control treaties with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, we didn't like them, we didn't trust them, but we had very detailed, sort of painfully detailed contracts where we identified what is a tank, what is a missile. We identified, to destroy a tank under the CFE treaty or missiles, you don't have to blow it up to smithereens, but it's, you cut it here and there and it's considered destroyed. So, it was like buying a car from someone that you don't trust. You identify that, a car includes 4 wheels, a carburetor, you define what everyone's requirements are. And, previous U.S. negotiators have said things like, well, North Korea is not the Soviet Union. We're not going to get a 1,000-page document. We're going to do it 1 page at a time to induce the turtle to stick his head out from the shell. And I'd say, well, you got to make sure each page is good. So this vague text where everyone can have a different interpretation of what everyone's requirements are, I think just leads to trouble. So you need to have very detailed. And the other one is verification. So with the agreed framework, we had good verification of the eggs in one basket, but we didn't have the verification outside that one basket. With verification, a lot of people see it as a negative, it's a gotcha, it's just going to, poison the atmosphere. I'd look at it as if the other side isn't cheating, it's a positive, it's a confidence security building measure. And as long as you have even a handful of challenge inspections, of short notice challenge inspections of non-declared facilities. So if you sort of walk through it and people say, well, you want 1 million inspections, like, in a way I need 1 because I'm holding the whole country hostage, but I might say 10 in the first year, 8 in the second year, 6 thereafter, something like that. And a short notice challenge inspection, the way it works is you go into the port of entry, you announce, to your host country, I want to go to facility X. Well, if they say no, you got a problem. If they say yes, but then they are moving stuff out the back door and you've got your national technical means monitoring it, if they're moving stuff out, you got a problem. If you show up and they don't let you in, you've got a problem. But if you go in and you've gone to the intel community and say, give me your most suspicious site, you go, you kick in the door, you walk around, you don't see anything, you still don't trust them, but you're a little more confident that maybe they're not cheating. If you go through number 2, number 3, number 4, well, then you feel that maybe they are abiding by it, so you continue that and maybe even have parallel things. But if you don't have good text, if you don't have verification, you really don't have an agreement.
So, Mark, now, North Korea said that they don't want an Iran-style agreement, but are there any elements in that agreement that might actually be beneficial in the North Korean case?
Well, there's certainly elements of the deal that I think would be beneficial to all parties concerned, because if it could relieve the concerns about a North Korean nuclear deal, if it could thereby relieve the concerns about the peninsula going up in flames, that's certainly beneficial for all parties. So what would a deal have to include that's similar to the Iran deal? The verification that Bruce mentioned, obviously you'd have to have a stringent verification. That's always been the problem with the North Koreans. That's why the 2008, the deal under the six-party talks basically broke down because of the disagreements on verification. And you'd probably want more than is even in the Iran deal. You'd want it. You probably wouldn't get it. I mean, the Iran deal verification is probably the gold standard. It's the best that's ever been negotiated. So if you could get that, you'd be satisfied. But people would say, no, you got to get also agreement to go into the military sites. Well, you can ask for it. You're probably not going to get that. You wouldn't, I think, have the same kind of limits that the Iran deal allowed for Iran to have enrichment. Because in the North Korean case, they used their fissile material for nuclear weapons. So there'd be no reason to allow enrichment or reprocessing, any fissile material production, because you wouldn't be confident that they wouldn't use it. Plus, they don't need it for anything, and they don't place any emphasis on it either. In the case of Iran, that was an absolute requirement. They had to be allowed enrichment or there weren't going to be any deal. In the case of North Korea, you probably have to have something analogous to the acceptance of enrichment. Something analogous, meaning something that North Korea really wants, that without it, they're not going to make a deal. And what's that thing? I think it's not in the nuclear realm at all. I think it's something else. It's probably a peace deal,
Yes.
which they keep talking about, and then this normalization with the United States that they talk about, whatever that means. So finding something like that, and then could we make a deal? I think a peace deal was not impossible for the United States to agree to, as long as it's just a peace treaty. If it's U.S. withdrawal of forces, abridgment of the alliance, well, that's up to the South Koreans to decide with the United States.
Well, did you want to say something?
Yeah, on the peace treaty, that I think is sort of a slippery slope. I mean, there's one side would say, look, we haven't had a major conflict in 70 years, so sign the treaty. I see it as you don't do it until you have like a CSBM treaty and a CFE treaty on the peninsula. Because if you sign a peace treaty, you've removed the legal justification for United Nations command. You may sort of set the stage for, well, if the war is over, bring the boys home, kind of impetus by people in the U.S. and South Korea. Then you may lead to the dissolution of Combined Forces Command, and CFC was going to go away under the original OPCON transfer plan. And then you're sort of left with U.S. Forces Korea, which looks like an occupying army. So if the perception is the war is over, have everyone go home, that's dangerous unless you have thinned out the conventional force threat to South Korea. So if you look where the 815th and the 806 Mex Corps are, the 820th Armor Corps, et cetera, they're forward deployed. So they're a standing start threat to South Korea. So I think a peace treaty would have to be at the end of a long, arduous conventional force, capping, thinning out kind of treaty. But something you could do even before that, which people have raised, I've raised it with North Koreans and others have, and they've always rejected, is confidence and security building measures discussions. So like when we were talking about freeze for freeze, it's like, well, our military exercises are legal, your launches aren't. That's not a good starting point. A more logical starting point, if they are so concerned that they're a precursor to an invasion, is let's do, discuss constraints on our military exercises in return for your winter training cycle, which is going on now, which they did not pause for the Peace Olympics. and the summer training cycle, that's at least apples to apples. Or even easier than that is, let's have CSBM discussions where it's transparency measures, notification measures. That reduces a potential for miscalculation by either side. So let's maybe start, as we're going for the goose that lays the golden egg or whatever of denuclearization. In the meantime, even absent that, we could be trying to talk about CSBMs.
Of course we should be talking about confidence and security building measures, and of course this should be step by step. But you're not going to get North Korea to give up its nuclear program in exchange for confidence building measures. You got to think big. What's the big thing that North Korea wants that would conceivably make them break through their insistence on having a nuclear program? And you don't give it up in the beginning, but that's why I say a peace treaty is something that they talk about at least. You at least have to think about this as a possibility.
Can we maybe sort of drill down on this just a bit? Because I guess the question would be is, we talk about peace treaties a lot, and it's often thrown out like we just need a peace treaty. But what do we really mean by that? Are we literally just talking about signing something that says the Korean War is now formally ended, we all live happily ever after? Or are we talking about a more comprehensive treaty that would deal with a broader range of issues in terms of the economic relationship between all the countries involved, things of that nature? So when we say peace treaty, I guess what do each of you maybe really conceive of when you think about that?
I think we don't know. I mean, we haven't really gotten to detailed discussion of it. And I think, many people have different views. Some, like under No Myuhan, it was sort of, you sign a document and it creates a peace regime, a positive feeling where then you solve other things. So you can sign the document today. It's a one-page, we're done here, you sign it. I would argue for a much more, involved, there's 3 zones of application. You thin out the forces. There's a cap of artillery and et cetera in different zones, like we did with CFE. The CSBM would not be as a way of getting denuked. That would be sort of a
In and of itself.
Or leading towards a peace treaty. Things I would keep it on a military side. Sort of all the economic benefits. It's like, well, you don't need to buy peace with grain and rice. The normalization of relations. People who were working North Korean issues in the government at the time were saying, it would tell you, it was North Korea that balked at having a U.S. embassy in Pyongyang, and in part because they saw the land prices in Washington, they weren't all that enamored with having an embassy in Washington. So I would argue that it was North Korea that was slow rolling the normalization of relations. But again, that's...
I think that's right. And maybe, if I could say, I think it's more than a piece of paper, of course, and it's more than a military end to the war. It's a relationship where the former adversary does not fear you anymore. And you have a developing relationship across the board, and you mentioned economics and political. The example I think of is U.S. Vietnam. When I grew up, Vietnam was enemy number 1. And you go to Vietnam today, and you're the best friends. We have a normal relationship with Vietnam. It took some time. We got over the hurdles of the POW issue and all that. And one reason we have such good relations with Vietnam is because they fear China. Well, isn't North Korea in the same situation in a way that Vietnam was fearing China? If we could strike a relationship with North Korea that would help them vis-a-vis another potential enemy, that might be what it would take.
Can I add there too? Another very good gesture or program that was started under the Clinton administration was the search for Americans missing in action still from the Korean War. There's still thousands of them. And the Pentagon worked with North Korea and arranged a number of these missions. They were terrific. I mean, it was a way for American military personnel to go into North Korea and have, build sort of limited relationships with quite senior North Korean military. It was a fascinating thing, and this was also stopped by the George W. Bush administration because the North Koreans had gotten some hard currency out of it. The hard currency was, was to pay for the expenses of these MIA missions and so on. So, I mean, this was the model that was used in Vietnam. They let us come in, search for missing in action, and this, of course, was promoted by a lot of very prominent Vietnam vets. Unfortunately, most of the Korean War vets are now gone or going from the scene. There had been some, though, who had been very involved in these kinds of MIA efforts. The wonderful Frank Matursky comes to mind, a U.S. Marine. So, you have to have these people-to-people ties as well. You have aid groups that go in. Some have still continued over all these years. You have education. You have American professors. You have things like this. Of course, some of them have been detained by the North Koreans, unfortunately. So there are ways to sort of build up to this.
So sticking with maybe one more question specifically on a deal, Bruce. In the Iran case, we did have the advantage of them having not tested the nuclear weapon. It made it easier to take and keep some part of the nuclear program in place, or maybe make a justification for that. Given where we are with North Korea, can you envision us allowing North Korea to, if they insist on keeping any of the program, or does basically the whole program have to go?
Well, people will talk to, the U.S. demands kind of denuclearization. I mean, we need to remember CVID is in the UN resolution. So it may have started as a U.S. term, but it is now the requirement under the UN resolutions. So then you can decide whether, let's water down the UN resolutions, to make a deal. You can argue whether the perfect's the enemy of the good, or the good enough, whatever, or why sell your principles down the road, or why sell the UN resolutions down the road? So debatable point, but. I think it's just very difficult. And, if at least North Korea says they're willing to do it, then that could be the star that you're following across the desert, and you're trying to solve things along the way, either capping it or freezing it or reducing it. And then you also have the debate of, do you focus on, is it a KISS? Keep it simple, stupid. Just focus on this. Or, as others have talked about, a grand bargain, where you're putting everything, we want this, but they want that, so just put it all together, or is that just too many moving parts to get things going? So, but I just don't really see any president accepting North Korea as a nuclear state. I think it undermines the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think it undermines U.S. non-proliferation policy for decades. I think that it makes the allies more nervous. It sort of seems like so you're negotiating something that makes your country safe while leaving mine exposed to nuclear weapons. So, it's just, there's a lot of moving parts. And then even if we dust off the six-party talks, in talking with North Koreans, when, we had the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, because as the negotiator said, we didn't want to single out North Korea. We didn't want them to feel bad. So, but that has opened the door, and some North Koreans have, when I said, does that mean you guys are expecting inspections in the South? And they kind of smile and smirk and say yes. Or, in talking with North Koreans, and who knows whether they're representing the government view, but they have a pretty expansive definition of what the Korean Peninsula is, because it's any nuclear force that can impact the Korean Peninsula. So some have said, well, yeah, of course that would include nuke-capable submarines, aircraft carriers, bombers, and then kind of really taking it afar. I said, well, would that include like ICBMs in North Dakota or South Dakota? And they're like, well, yeah, if they're targeted at the north. It's like, well, okay, that's a really wide definition of the Korean Peninsula. So even just dusting off the six-party talks, again, we need to narrow our terms. But I think any U.S. president would be looking for total denuclearization, at least as an end goal.
So I just have a couple more questions I want to ask you all before turning things over to our audience. So, Barbara, there has been a lot of discussion about missile cooperation between North Korea and Iran. What do we sort of really know in terms of that cooperation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I should defer to Mark, and Mark will probably add on to this. I think that that Iran's got some nodongs from North Korea during the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War. There have been some reports of Iranians being seen at North Korean sites, but it's my impression, judging from the work that people at ISS have done, that the missile programs are quite different. They're not really copying each other at all, and if you look at recent news accounts, it seems as though North Korea has a much stronger relationship with Egypt when it comes to missiles than it does with Iran. So I think it's overdone. I mean, they both obviously benefited from the original Scud technology of the Soviet Union. This was the basis for the missiles that that both countries have built, but they've diverged. And when it comes to the nuclear program, of course, Iran got a lot of help from Pakistan, from AQ Khan, later from the Russians and the Chinese in the 90s in refining their enrichment program. Their program primarily uranium enrichment, and North Korea primarily plutonium. So I don't think it's a huge concern, but Mark,
I think, basically, just to add on that, the missile cooperation was extensive in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
It petered off in the last decade, and U.S. Senior intelligence officials have said so. They talk about it as in the past tense. It doesn't mean it couldn't flare up again, but the missile cooperation, you can't find evidence today. Nuclear cooperation, no evidence at all in the past or the present. There have been lots of stories about it. Those stories are very poorly sourced, usually from outlets that have a political agenda. They're trying to attack the Iran nuclear deal, so they talk about North Korea as a reason. But the evidence is, the evidence of Iranians at North Korean nuclear test sites. It's one source, and I just don't think it's credible. And U.S. officials have said there's no cooperation on the nuclear front. They've said that in testimony. So doesn't mean there couldn't be. I mean, there's a logic to it. And there's greater logic before Iran came in from the cold in the Iran nuclear deal, when they were both rogue states and outlaws, a logic to cooperate. When the Iran nuclear deal came into play, there's much less logic because Iran now has a legitimate way of getting nuclear technology for its civilian program. It's under the deal. But there's we still have to keep a close eye on it. I'm not ruling it out at all. I just don't want to make any suggestions that it's there. And we see what happened when you make suggestions about WMD programs that aren't there. You get an Iraq war.
So the last question I'd like to ask, and maybe each of you, if you just want to maybe briefly touch on it. So we're at a point now to where the North Koreans may be interested in talks. We don't know where that's going to go. But prior to that, there were essentially two things that could have changed the dynamics of talks that the U.S. was talking and doing. One was, and this has died down some recently, this idea of a bloody nose. So would a bloody nose have any beneficial effect, on talks, or would it, basically preclude them? And then the other is how might the North Koreans react if we did actually pull out of the Iran deal? Would that tell them this would be a hard bargain, or would that tell them there is no bargain? So maybe I'll just start with Barbara and we can go down.
Yeah, on the latter, I'll pick that one up. I think this is sort of. I'm delighted for many reasons that the North Koreans are now interested in talking. But one of the reasons that I'm delighted is that I think it makes it even harder for the Trump administration to pull out of the JCPOA when Iran is complying with it. I mean, how do you then explain that to North Korea, and what possible incentive could there be for North Korea to negotiate away any aspect of its nuclear program if the United States won't even implement an agreement with another country that is working? So, I'm hopeful on that account. In terms of bloody nose, I don't believe in this. This is insanity, and we have to, maintain peace on the Korean Peninsula at all costs, because the consequences would just be horrific.
On the bloody nose, I mean, first of all, the term, people inside the government will say they never said that term. It's kind of a work of art from the media. So, but in a way, I think there's been a little bit of spinning of the media where folks on the inside will say, we never said, we're not considering a bloody nose, and we're not considering anything imminent. And then some in the media have interpreted that as, look, that means they're not considering a preventive attack as an option. It's like, no, if you kind of parse the language, it's, they may not be considering it imminently. I think it's more like there are two policy envelopes, engagement and pressure, and the third one of preventive attack is on the other side of the table, but it's kind of marching itself towards you. And if you weren't ever using the word bloody nose, well, then you never are considering a bloody nose because you're considering something else. But I think on the preventive attack, which is different from the normal U.S. strategy of retaliatory or preemptive, it's a new category layered onto it. I think if you look at the number of public statements by senior officials, as well as the private statements that all of us who talk to people in the government hear, I have never seen such a kind of a unanimous view across the Korea Watcher community of a certainty that it is being considered as an option. And as one colleague said, they're seriously considering it as an option. And you can either focus on the first half of seriously consider and get really nervous, or you can focus on the second half as an option and be less nervous. But what I found is this issue has sort of consumed the Korea Watchers for the last year, almost to the point of, every day we call each other and like, hey, I just talked to somebody on the inside and, I'm less nervous. Oh, well, I just talked to somebody and I'm more nervous. Okay, talk to you tomorrow. And so, again, all of us talk to people and comparing notes, and I think we're all very convinced that it's being considered as an option. And then when I was in Seoul a couple weeks ago, I had a senior official contact me to convey their nervousness, a very extreme nervousness. So anyway, I think it's a lower likelihood now because we're now engaged in this. And some have heard me, I've kind of likened the current situation to a Korean Game of Thrones. In December, it was like you're watching the inevitable clash of the armies, and you're just sort of getting your popcorn and watching, waiting for this clash. And then all of a sudden one season ends, the new season starts on January 1st, and you're really confused because now the script of the new season is the emissaries for two kings talking to each other. The third king is looking across the narrow sea trying to figure out what his king is doing, his ally. And now everyone is engrossed in, after you've made the mental change, to the diplomacy and the engagement. In the meantime, the army in the north is still building up its forces. The security situation hasn't changed. And then it's sort of at some point it may be, oh yeah, that military stuff, we forgot about that. And so this diplomatic engagement, is it a breakthrough or an invitation to the Red Wedding?
Well, aren't the North Koreans really the White Walkers?
Yes, so the North Koreans White Walkers. I'm sure they'll appreciate that.
Bruce and I have the same kind of conversations. I'm not as good as analogies, but look, the so-called limited strike option that's being considered, that is going to lead to a war. And whether it's a limited or a massive, the outcome is pretty much the same. And I did a war game scenario that'll be in the New York Times op-ed pages in the next few days, and it'll explain. You can go play this game and see how it comes out. And I hope that everybody in the White House knows this. I think there might be maybe one person who doesn't know this, but I think everybody in the Pentagon knows this. So why do they talk about it, since they know this? And so let's be charitable. It's all a bluff. And it's all, and maybe it's working. Maybe it's actually getting the North Korean leadership to think, you know what? We got to stop testing missiles and we got to start talking diplomacy. Maybe, just maybe, let's give credit to President Trump, and if peace breaks out, he can get the Nobel Peace Prize.
There you go.
If I could just add is, I think all of us in the Korea Watcher community have written, anyone who's been around the block a time or two working in Korea, I think we've all written or done interviews saying we think it's a bad idea. I mean, I've had kind of an op-ed in the LA Times where I think I listed 10 or so reasons why it's not a good idea. My colleagues at Brookings and CSIS and I, so Jung Pak and Sumi Terry and I had a trilateral op-ed, which is kind of cool because it's, 3 think tanks thinking alike and all former CIA, or are we former? So, and everyone probably in the room has written articles as to why we think this is a bad idea for a number of reasons.
Mark, if that comes off again, there's another mic right there that you can use as well, a handheld.
I think it's working, though. It's working.
It's good?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so I'd like to open up to questions now. We'll have mics come. We'll start with the gentleman right here, if you give your name and affiliation.
Hi, Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Just for a point of clarification here, we're starting to see a number of discussions that involve both Iran and North Korea because they're considered rogue states. But it seems to me that there's a tremendous difference between them as far as a threat to the United States. And I'd like to hear from the three of you to go on record of, how the magnitude of the threat, I think, is so different. I'd like to hear some perspective on that. And also, if one looks at the world map, it seems that there's quite a few additional nations between Iran and the United States. And there are certainly many more parties to that deal. We haven't heard much about how the European and other parties would react to anything the United States must do in that regard. And that should be enough for now. Thank you.
Okay. How much of a threat is Iran to the United States? Look, North Korea has nuclear weapons which presumably could be deliverable and could hit the United States. Iran does not. What Iran does have, however, is a much more robust foreign policy in terms of its intervention in regional conflicts. And Iran has proxies or its own forces deployed in many countries where the United States also has forces deployed. So I neglected to mention this when we were talking about the implications of a U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. But one way in which Iran might respond might have nothing to do with its nuclear program at all, and could be actually, through attacks on American forces in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, where Iran has its own forces or has proxy forces. Iran is a much more serious competitor for regional influence than North Korea is. No one's going to copy North Korea's system, but Iran is attempting to export aspects of its system through its support for militias in places like Iraq and Syria. So it's a more serious regional competitor. We also have the added complications that Iran is perceived as a threat by our close partners in the region, namely Israel and Saudi Arabia. So it's a much more complicated business in many ways with Iran, even though it does not have nuclear weapons.
In the Rogue Regime Club, which makes me think of all of them sitting around a table as someone is stroking the white cat, Mr. Bigglesworth. I think North Korea is roguier.
North Korea is definitely roguier.
I think it's a more direct military threat, conventional, biological, chemical, cyber, nuclear, everything. So I think it's certainly the wolf closest to the sled.
But are they the rogue or the leader of the rogues?
Yeah. And Iran would argue it's no longer a rogue because, with the JCPOA, they're no longer subjected to special scrutiny by the UN Security Council in the way that they were from 2002 up until 2015. So technically, they're not a rogue at all.
They didn't pay their dues.
To the UN or the Rogue Club.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Boyoung Shin from Muna Daily in South Korea. And a special envoy from, Korean government just arrived today, DC, and then they are scheduled to meet the United States officials here. And then they will deliver some messages from Kim Jong-un when they met, the last week. And then there's so what kind of messages from Kim Jong-un does, this envoy deliver for President Trump? And then there is some speculation about that. Maybe the Kim's message is to willingness to suspend the missile program and then release the American hostages. So do you think, that President Trump will accept this for starting the talk with North Korea?
Pretty good.
I'm reluctant to anticipate what the message is. I'd rather wait and see the message. But the second part of your question, I think, is more easy to address. Should President Trump accept any such steps as a reason to begin talks? I would say absolutely. Not begin negotiations, because I think you need to know what the goal of the negotiations is, and I think there's reason to posit denuclearization as a goal. But talks to begin a communication channel. And the release of American hostages, and I would call them hostages, would be an appropriate step that I think the United States should take yes for an answer and at least begin a communications.
Yeah, I don't want to conjecture on what could be in the envelope. It could be no, my button is bigger than yours. It could be some expansive, wonderful diplomatic outreach, or it could be just sort of yeah, we're willing to talk if you give up your hostile policy. So we don't know. But again, I think even just the meeting between the two Koreas, and there does seem to be a bit of a different readout from the South and the North as to what was agreed to, and that's pretty typical. So, obviously the U.S. officials will want to get a full readout of what exactly was said and that. But, I think occasionally we do have to take yes for an answer. And if especially our ally has gone down this path, whether we're being dragged into it or not, it's now there. So, we should always, as I said before, have our diplomats meet with their diplomats. So, if the South Korean approach was sort of a top-down, they went very senior delegation and then met with Kim Jong-un, I would advocate on the U.S. side more bottom-up. The problem is we don't have sort of the obvious Korean envoy. We don't have an ambassador, et cetera. So kind of the bench is thin, but I would think more sort of at the diplomatic level, or whether some have been saying there will be an outside special envoy brought in. I wouldn't send the president. I wouldn't send a sec state. I think I'd be more of a bottom or middle move up to at least discuss the parameters.
I mean, Bruce, we can get you a plane ticket tomorrow if you want.
I got that great white shark cave dive, which I think is going to be much more relaxing.
George.
Sounds like you should do the job.
I like my sharks.
Yeah, extraordinary discussion, very diverse. So with sort of a deja vu all over again kind of feeling with the potential for talks with North Korea, the agreed framework was arguably the closest thing that we really got to, as far as having successful negotiations with the North. And that was a time where the regional order in Northeast Asia was very favorable to South Korea. You had rapprochement with China going on. You had fairly cordial relations with then Russia. And when you compare that now with what some would argue to be an erosion of the regional order there, China very displeased, very averse to anything having to do with U.S. presence, theater, ballistic missile defense, relations with Russia really not good at all. So what impacts does that have on our ability to negotiate with North Korea now that the international or the regional framework really favors North Korea, unlike it did before with South Korea?
I don't think it favors North Korea at all.
I don't think so.
Maybe it doesn't favor South Korea as much as it did for the reasons that you stated. But does North Korea have any allies today? It used to have China. Nobody considers China an ally today. Russia is trying to get back into the game, but they're not really a major player. I don't think North Korea's got that much going for them except the mistakes of its adversaries.
Yeah, I might agree. I think, all your points are good, but I think North Korea has been acting so badly for so long that they've kind of united everyone against them. I think even at the tail end of the six-party talks, they were sort of complaining it was 5 versus 1. And certainly their behavior since then has, I think, angered Russia and China even more. I think Putin's playing more of a meddler role than Russia has before. In the past, it was usually Russia's role was to say whatever China said 2 days earlier. Now I think they're trying to kind of offset if China cuts back. I think Putin's willing to sort of increase a bit. But China has allowed greater resolutions. They're never as good as we want. They're incrementally better. Sometimes a big step, but they're steps rather than what we would have wanted earlier. But I feel since the fourth nuke test in January of 2016, that had a big impact. A lot of South Korean officials, and it was obviously the other previous administration, were sort of, this one's different. And it's sort of like, well, why weren't the first 3 different? But it seemed after the fourth one, it led South Korea to close Kaesong, and China, I think allowed bigger steps forward. So I think the deck is stacked against North Korea, but they're kind of small and wiry and play a pretty good hand, even with a bad hand.
Yeah, the UN Security Council resolutions, case in point. This administration has not been very successful at the UN, except when it comes to North Korea. All those unanimous resolutions. Russia, China just blocked some resolutions against Iran. over, I think it was Yemen or some missile, whatever. The other thing is, I mean, the North Koreans continued their missile tests, and the Iranians stopped their missile tests. They haven't had a major missile test in a year. Yeah. So North Korea has been much more provocative.
You know, and another thing with South Korea, I mean, a number of us are wary that Moon's going to cut left and try to do something on his own. But, you know, at least we're in a better starting place with him than I had expected. I think, you know, when we were talking about the South Korean election on this stage, or the stage plus 7 floors, you know, I had expressed nervousness about Moon, but I think a lot because of North Korean behavior. They pushed him more to the center than perhaps he was planning on, just as they made Obama adopt a tougher policy than he had planned on because of nuke and missile tests. So I think, I mean, Moon reversed himself on THAAD and Kaesong and other things. So, you know, I think we're in a good starting place. And when I was in Seoul, all the officials were saying the right things. And even, what is today, yesterday, Moon saying, look, the sanctions don't come off, you know. So we're in a good starting place. We're still nervous. He'll cut left. But he faces a lot of international and domestic constraints. The international is he can't just catapult bags of cash north of the DMZ like they did before. He can't reopen Kaesong. And domestically, the South Korean public is much more critical of North Korea because of the 2 attacks in 2010. They're much more skeptical that engagement will work. They're much more supportive of the alliance. So, you know, one factor is that I think is more off the table than before is, you know, South Korea can't go rogue as much, whether they intend to or not. So again, I think it's keeping people together. Obviously, China would want us to come to a deal earlier than we might want to, but it's sort of, you know, we've got the posse surrounding the bad guys, you know, in Deadwood Gulch. The problem is keeping the posse together for a long time is tough because somebody always wants to go home or go inside and negotiate. So keeping them together is what's the tough part.
Or has a steel tariff to deal with.
Yes, steel tariffs. Yeah.
Gentleman right here in the front.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Well, I guess I follow up on Bruce's possible worry that South Korea might go rogue or Moon might lurch left. I've heard from analysts in the U.S. government, and maybe they aren't putting it in the op-ed pages, but what they're worried about is that Kim Jong-un is offering South Korea, or will at this meeting of the 2 leaders, a confederation or federated Korea. So sort of like they'll keep their system, South keep their system, but in certain international situations, it'll be like the Olympics. There'll be one flag, one negotiation. Now, if the South were to accept that, then the whole issue about the nuclear negotiations is going to be between a federated, united Korea and the rest of the world. And remember, the Park, who was the prime minister way back when, tried to get nuclear weapons for South Korea. And also, South Korea is constantly chafing under the restrictions on enrichment that the U.S. has imposed on them and wants to get out of it. And then there's the issue of the joint command. So I think that's really what's going to happen, because it's like in Sherlock Holmes. Once you've ruled out all the possibilities as impossible, then the only remaining possibility has to be the one that's going to happen. There's no way they can unite the peninsula outside of a federated situation where it's sort of separate states but federated. And this is the lesson of the German reunification. The Germans had enough money to barely pay for reunification with the East, but the Koreans don't. So I think that a lot of this issue about the nuclear issue is actually going to be quickly subsumed under some kind of major surprising move on the reunification front. And the question is, how's the U.S. going to respond to that? Because these analysts that I've talked to in the U.S. government, they're really worried about this and how we would handle it.
I frankly think that that's an impossibility. I think the German example shows that the only unification is when one half takes over the other half. There's no federation in the German case. And no, the Germans took over East Germany. There was no negotiated takeover. It was one collapsed. And that's the only unification I can see in the Korean Peninsula. I cannot, have you ever heard of any South Korean official talk these days about confederation?
Well, for years, the North has advocated federation and the South has advocated confederation or vice versa. I forget which. But I think on unification, I mean, to me, it's got to be absorption. No one likes to say it, but if according to Article 4 of the South Korean Constitution, it's got to be unification under the principles of freedom and democracy, which don't exist in North Korea. So, federation, confederation. I mean, those are sort of like stapling two things to each other. But a real unification is it's integrated. It's basic absorption. I mean, you can't average out the two systems. I mean, you don't keep half the gulags. You don't have 10 in human rights and a 0 and aim for
40%.
5. Right?
40%.
Yeah. So I think
That's not a reaction to how we would react. You're just saying it's not going to happen.
There's nothing to react to.
Yeah. No, I would say if it's going to happen, I think it's more unification. But I think, unless there's a sudden, unexpected collapse of the North, I think it would be a sort of a slow boat, and I think we'd have time to react to it. But I don't see the South accepting something like that, because I think the citizens would say, we don't want to give up anything, and why kind of marry yourself to to a despicable partner? So I just don't see it as an issue.
Yeah, and I mean, from a political standpoint, basically it's sort of a mirage of upside, and there's only downside for Moon if you redo it, so it's really unlikely. Okay, Larry, and then, because we're almost out of time, Dan, and then was there a question? And then we'll get the lady in the back and then wrap up.
I want to go back to the North Korean-Iranian relationship. Last week we had a seminar here about the impact of sanctions. And Bill Brown, our friend and colleague, argues that sanctions are really hurting North Korea. But it also came up that if Iran continues to supply large financial inflows to North Korea for various types of collaboration, that this inflow of money could provide a cushion, softening the blow of sanctions. Bruce Bechtold's estimates were mentioned. Now, I don't agree with either of you that Iranian-North Korean collaboration is abating much at all. Frankly, in the missile field, in the nuclear field, certainly in Syria, from what we learned last week from the UN Commission report about what the North Koreans are doing in Syria, which I think you have to believe the Iranians are financing. I don't think the Assad government would have the resources to pay for the missiles and chemical weapons components that it has been getting through 40 separate shipments from North Korea, as outlined in the report. But my question is, if Bill Brown is correct and the sanctions are really hurting North Korea, would this make Kim Jong-un be willing to make more concessions on the nuclear issue in negotiations? But conversely, if in fact Iranian money is cushioning the effect of sanctions, how would this affect the conditions or demands that he might make on the U.S. in future negotiations?
Let me reframe that. Let's set aside whether it's Iran or anything, but if there is a cushion we don't know about.
Can I just say something on this question? I mean, it is possible. I mean, I read the report that there were chemical weapons precursors coming from North Korea. How much they were paid for it, I don't know. But Iran is spending, to the extent it is spending money abroad, it is spending it on Hezbollah. It is spending it, yes, on propping up Assad. It's spending it on the militias in Iraq. Iran is not a major funder of North Korea. Iran is not providing a cushion to North Korea. China is the one that has historically provided that cushion to North Korea through...
There's evidence to the contrary.
There's no evidence, Larry.
There's no major... I mean, there is no evidence of any financial transfers from Iran to North Korea that I have seen, and I follow it very closely.
2012, that Iranian nuclear scientists were in North Korea.
They have not said that in any testimony in Congress. It's only people who say it to one reporter in a journal that is not double sourced. It's some unknown, unnamed official who may have said that, but it's not testimony that's been confirmed.
Sounds like NEK propaganda to me.
This is why I wanted to reframe the question.
Sorry.
All right.
The impact of sanctions are biting, or whether it's whatever, there is some kind of cushion the North Koreans have that we aren't, we'll say, fully aware of.
Well, I'd say, if there's an economic interaction, it's either a violation of sanctions or it's not. We're not sanctioning every economic transaction. So I haven't read the report, but if something is sanctionable, then we should go after it, regardless of the country. My gripe has been we have not gone after Chinese entities that are violating U.S. law. For whatever reason, the Congress gave a list of 12 banks to the White House, and they've not taken action against any of them. So sort of regardless of the nationality, we don't go after Chinese entities because they're Chinese, but we also don't not go after them because they're Chinese. So if they're Iranian entities that are doing something against the sanctions, then we should, kind of justice is blind. It doesn't matter what the nationality is.
What about Egypt? What about the presence of all these, North Korean missile engineers in Cairo?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a
Actually,
huge...
those, I think they were conventional weapons. I don't think they were missiles.
Conventional missiles.
So,
but this arms relationship between Egypt and North Korea is a much more serious problem than any relationship now between Iran and North Korea, certainly on the military front.
Dan?
Dan Wirtz from the National Committee on North Korea. To follow up on that discussion, to what extent would you all say that the threat or the reality of U.S. secondary sanctions contributed to economic pressure in Iran around 5 years ago when sanctions were really maxed out? And to what extent have the threat or reality of U.S. secondary sanctions contributed to the increase of economic pressure in North Korea over the past year?
Okay. Before you answer, let's get the lady in the back, and so that way we can wrap it up.
Hi, it's Stephanie Cook with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I wanted to ask you about the situation in Washington now, but start back on New Year's Day when Kim Jong-un made his New Year's Day speech. And that speech seemed to have a lot of emphasis on reunification. Then he made the overture about the Olympics, and there was a lot of speculation that he was trying to drive a wedge in relations between Seoul and Washington. And there were statements by Moon to the effect that we will never allow a war on the peninsula, and so on and so forth. And now he makes this next signal, which is the biggest one. What are the risks, though, that given the preponderance of planning and strategy over a war with North Korea versus negotiation, and the absence of high-level expertise at the State Department, that this thing will fall apart because of weakness in Washington? What are the risks that, this is an opening, but what are the risks if we let's just put it frankly, if we blow it?
All right, maybe we'll just start with Barbara and then go down.
Sure. On the secondary sanctions, that was very, very important. As I said, what really turned the tide was the fact that the Europeans, Japanese, South Koreans, after the end of 2012, agreed to substantially reduce their imports of Iranian oil. And that was because of U.S. legislation. So it was secondary sanctions, our sanctions influencing the economic activities of third parties. And on whether it would have an impact on North Korea. I mean, the thing with Iran is an oil exporter. And it also had much more developed economic relations with many more countries. So in a sense, it was somewhat more vulnerable. With North Korea, my understanding is it's still primarily China that determines whether North Korea survives or not. So,
right. On secondary sanctions, the U.S., the EU, and the UN had done stronger sanctions on Iran than on North Korea. When President Obama said North Korea was the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, it wasn't. At the time, it was the 9th most heavily sanctioned country by the United States unilaterally. We had sanctioned more Zimbabwe and Sudanese entities than North Korean. So we've had a number of tranches since then where the numbers are up high. But on secondary sanctions, we imposed $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. We've imposed $0 in fines on any Chinese bank for money laundering for North Korea. So I think that's where we've been pulling our punches. So it's not maximum pressure if you're not going after the Chinese violators. One other thing, I thought you were going to sort of bring up human rights, which I think is something we all too often overlook. I think the president had very good speeches in the National Assembly when he was there, and the State of the Union, where he called out North Korea on its human rights conditions. But I would like to see that action followed up with by announcing additional entities of North Korea that are sanctioned for their human rights violations. I think we've still only announced the 10 or so during the Obama administration. I don't think we've done any since then on human rights. That's something that I think also should be added. On the January 1st speech, I've been reading them for 24 years. I didn't see it as that different from the other ones. Some people will say it was very different. I feel like it always has an outreach to their compatriots in the South. I thought what was different this year, I mean, they mentioned the Olympics because that doesn't happen in South Korea every year. But I thought the difference was that the South Korean president more eagerly grasped at the olive branch than that it was a different olive branch. And I think at the time, they were grabbing at it because they were so afraid of a threat or an attack or a provocation during the Olympics. And then the story kind of evolved into reconciliation and stuff. So, and on the driving the wedge, it's not like we don't know that's what they're trying to do. So, when we get a phone call from the guard at the gate and they say, North Korea is wheeling up this large wooden horse and we hear whispering inside, and we're sort of like, again? Okay, bring it in, but we've seen this horse before, so we're going to work together to prevent the wedge from being driven. And then as for which country mucks up the current peace initiative, well, we'll see. And I'm going to put my money on North Korea, but we'll see.
You stole my line. I was going to, there are so many ways this could go wrong. We're just at the very initial stages, at the beginning of the first steps of maybe something going on. And, it's much more likely that North Korea would do something or not do something. But your question is, what would be the downsides and the risks? And it's a huge, huge opportunity cost if the United States doesn't try to seize the opportunity that has been presented. It's probably false. We don't know much about it. It's ambiguous, but there's a potential here. And if we don't seize this, the downside risks are huge of a war on the Korean Peninsula or North Korea posing a nuclear threat to American cities. Those are huge, huge risks. And it shouldn't be one or the other. There should be some negotiated way forward. We got to try everything possible to see if that's a way out.
Well, this has been a really great conversation. If you'll join me in thanking all of our guests, this has been great. Thanks.